She did. She may or may not make it tonight. Tomorrow night's gonna be her tougher night, it sounds like. Test. And you remember, Lisa, that we don't actually, we just do a meeting called, or hearing called to order, because it's not an actual meeting, it's just the hearing.
Just call a hearing to order
Yep.
with a vote though, or I just
Nope,
say?
we don't,
just
I don't
say
think so,
call to
because we're
order.
not, there's
So I
no
don't
need to vote,
Have no
because
vote for anything today, no voting.
it's, yes, it's strictly just to solicit, for me to do a brief presentation and to solicit input. Yeah, I told Mary if she's not here, we'll just assume she's not coming.
right, we'll call the hearing to order. The welcome notice, the notice of hearing has been posted as required by law. So we'll go on with the budget presentation.
All right, so I just want to start by saying, just kind of reminder to everyone why we do this on two separate nights. And I know it's very inconvenient. I kind of want to just give just a quick summary of that. A few years back, the unicameral changed a law requiring that the hearing for the budget and the hearing for the tax request cannot be limited by time. And apparently there were enough presentations that I sat through that it kind of resonated with me that if you set one hearing and then set another hearing, if you, and the times don't align too much, then you could say that was a violation of the publication. And they said the only way you could really ensure that both hearings were not limited by time is have them on separate nights. I do think there are still some districts that do it on the same night and just have a meeting and then they open it up and say, this is the hearing for both and you can talk on either issue. But there was enough that I guess got my attention a few years back when that law changed that made me think we probably should err on the side of caution and do it this way. So I apologize for that we've got to come in 2 nights in a row to talk about the same thing, but that's was the logic for that. So I want to start out, don't have a lot of information, but it is still can be pretty complicated, and feel free to stop me at any point and ask questions for clarification. If there's more information you want, odds are I can get it, or if I don't have it or have it, readily available off the top of my head, I'll gladly look it up and get it to you later on. So starting, just the packet, it's just like 7 pages is all. Starting with the second page, this of course is the notice of budget hearing and budget summary that is published in the paper. So I would start with that. The first column is the dollar amounts that were audited last year for the 21-22 budget. So that's when you build a budget, the actual budget document. There's other components to a budget, but the actual budget document, you start with end of year audit numbers and you plug them into the spreadsheets and it populates these. So these were actual total expenditures and transfers for the entire 21-22 fiscal year for each fund. And then you plug in the numbers, and as the year goes on, as I start working on the budget, these get tweaked and modified, and these are actual or estimated because it reflects the current fiscal year, which hasn't been audited yet, nor has it completed because it doesn't conclude until August 31st. The new fiscal year starts on September 1st of 2023. But these are based off of August numbers after the end of the August board meeting that reflect pretty good estimates of dollar amounts that were expensed in each fund down that 22-23 column. So you've got, of course, the general fund, which is most operations. You have the depreciation fund, which kind of as its name implies, it's for depreciation. It's money you take out. It's considered in the eyes of the law an extension of the general fund, and it's basically money you're taking out of general fund and you're setting aside for down the road when something has depreciated and you need to replace it. It can be for facilities. It can be for supplies. I mean, technically, you could even buy textbooks out of it. You could really pay for anything on claims that's not payroll or new services and expenses out of depreciation. But you're setting that money aside for, the big thing we've used it for is buses, boilers, HVAC type situations, resurfacing the playground. That was depreciation of something physical. And it can typically it's used for facilities or transportation fleet. Employee Benefit Fund, that's money that was set aside years ago. I think probably in the Kaler or prior era. And typically, what we've used it for is unemployment claims. And so you could, it's 50,000 roughly that we have in there, so it's not a large dollar amount. But typically that's, I don't know what it was ever originally set aside for, but it's set aside for salary supplemental. I mean, you could pay insurance out of it, you could pay, but it's, again, it's money that's set aside for you know, unexpected expenses or in difficult financial times. Activities is, Mr. Niss oversees activities, and it's a lot of different things, but it's, you know, activities is kind of a broad heading. It can be a lot of it. We house fine arts in there. We house the athletic boosters in fine arts, or excuse me, in the activities fund. It pays for uniforms. It's you know, officials. Most new sporting and or extracurricular type of purchases are made from activities. And it also serves as a revolving fund by default for Education Foundation purchases as well. And so sometimes at Education Foundation, as we've started to do a little more, we'll just pay for it directly, because then we don't have to code it as a district activities expense. But when we buy it and the foundation reimburses us, we do that through the activities fund. School nutrition is our lunch fund. It's pretty much anything that's breakfast or lunch related. All of the, you know, that's about 60% of the funds that goes into that are USDA federal funds. So Department of Ed closely monitors how you use that money, and they've got some pretty strict restrictions on how you can use that money unless it's paid for, unless it's reimbursed or supplemented by the general fund. So basically it has to comply with USDA guidelines on what's acceptable use of federal lunch funds. And that's because about 60% of our money that goes in there is reimbursement for free and reduced lunch. QCPUF is, excuse me, I skipped one. Building fund, special building fund is kind of like depreciation. The difference is you transfer into depreciation, you levy into building fund. They overlap in the sense that they both cover facilities, and usually they're used for facility type expenses. But the special building fund cannot be used for transportation. And unlike depreciation, special building fund can be used for replacement or new construction. So sometimes it's how you word the motion. They taught me that early on at Department of Ed. It's, are you replacing something? If you are, word it that way in your motion. If you're doing something new, that you can always pay for that stuff out of general fund, but if you want to levy into building fund, if you've got room and it is subject to the $5 levy limit, but if you've, and so there are some districts that levy $5 into their general fund and they couldn't put any into their special building fund. You have other districts, there's one that's nearby, Diller Odell, when they built their add-on with their gymnasium, they did that on a 7-year lease purchase, and they paid for that out of the building fund, so they didn't have to go to the public for a vote. Now, they had cushion in their levy to do that. That's not realistic for a lot of districts, including us. And it also has gained the ire of many senators who feel like that's circumventing the whole concept of putting bond issues. They don't like the idea of a bond being paid for, or something that looks like a bond being paid for without it going to a vote of the public and having to go through what JCC just went through a couple times and not getting a bond to pass. QCPUF, it's a special program that set up about a decade ago through state legislation that allowed certain qualified capital upgrades to be paid for through a levy up to, I think when it was originally passed, I don't remember the dollar amount, but I'm thinking it was an additional 10 cents that could be levied into the building, or the QC Puff. And when they first did it, it was pretty wide open. It could be used for just about anything that was a capital upgrade. They've since really pared it down, and they pretty much says it has to be, like, for example, you can't do an HVAC project anymore. Like ours was grandfathered in, but you can't do an HVAC project anymore unless you are replacing mold, which they'll tell you also that any good engineer or architect can find mold. But that, it has to, they've really limited the scope of what that can be used for. And then, of course, that comes up with the totals. And so when you look at what's budgeted for the 23-24 fiscal year, I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. It falls into, generally speaking, the spreadsheets will publish the total dollar amount of how much you think you're going to spend plus how much you have in the bank on September 1st of the fiscal year. So, but you can kind of inflate that or deflate that depending upon, which I do both when I prepare this budget, and I'll talk about that. General fund, the financial folks say you don't ever want to give away budget authority, because like, for example, what I think we're going to spend in the given year in the general fund and what our budget authority is about 1.3 million higher than what my actual dollar amount that I think we're going to budget or going to spend in the next fiscal year. But if you gave that away in a year, then it's gone for the next year, and you can only grow it by so much. And they said, just if there's ever a time down the road you might need it, you don't want to lose it. So that includes what is, I don't know if it's official title, but unused budget authority. It also includes special education expenses, which you project on special education, which is outside of the, is not limited to your budget maximum. So you can budget more if it's above your budget authority if it's in special education. I actually put in sped expenses about 200,000 less than what I think they're going to be, or even a little less, just because we don't need that big of a dollar amount in the budget. And admittedly, it just looks better in the paper if that number is small, because the average person doesn't know why that number is so big, because they, if they haven't been in the budget document. So I try to keep it a little smaller than because we're not going to spend $6.2 million in the general fund with a combination of regular ed and special education. So that's actually a small number, a little bit smaller number, but it more than covers. If we were to spend any more than this dollar amount in any one of these boxes, we have to amend the budget. And we've had to do that a couple times, and I'll kind of talk about that when we get to those. So depreciation, that's just total dollar amount that we have. You don't have to budget it all, but typically you budget your total dollar amount knowing that you could spend it if you need to. Employee benefit, that would be total dollar amount that we have in there. Activities in school nutrition, I actually budget more than our total dollar amount for the reasons I referred to. They're revolving funds, with the exception of the transfer we put into activities that I'll ask the board to do tomorrow night. Those are self-sufficient funds, meaning the receipts are coming from sales or coming from gate admission to games. For lunch, it's for sales of meals, or the bulk of it is actually meal reimbursement for free and reduced meals. When the pandemic hit and the government started paying for meals, and we did all summer grab and go meals, we spent a lot more than what was budgeted, and so we had to amend the budget that year. There was one year in foundation, or in activities, that the foundation gave us something, and it was just the way expenses one year they fell into one fiscal year, and the next year, summer purchases fell into another fiscal year, so there was like a 2-summer overlap, and then you compounded that with some big foundation purchases, and we were over budget in activities, so I had to ask the board to republish that as well, so I've put those numbers pretty big, so we don't have to republish the budget. Building fund would be total dollar amount in there now, and the $50,000 that I will ask the board tomorrow night to approve on the tax request. QC Puff should be the $75,000 that will be coming in next year if the board approves that tax request, plus everything that's in there currently, plus everything I think we're going to get, through the end of this. Now I'm confusing myself. Hopefully we put enough in there. Well, if we need to, we can republish. But it should be everything that we've got in, because we can't spend more than we have. So I just had to talk that through in my brain. So we'll have the dollar amount we have, the dollar amount we'll get through the end of this fiscal year, and then the 75 for next year, and that will pay off our final bond payment on the QC Puff bond that was done in 2013. That includes the money we have in the bank right now, what we'll get in these remaining months, and then next year, and then we shouldn't have to levy into that again. There is a little bit of a discrepancy, so the final payment will come due in December 15th of 2024, I believe. We won't obviously get that last December property tax check until January of 25. So we can pay that out of, I knew this, but I still checked with Department of Ed to confirm. You can pay that out of either general or building fund, any taxing fund. You can borrow it and then pay it back. And we'd probably keep it open for a few months to collect delinquent taxes, and then at some point close it out, unless there was a desire to do a QC Puff project down the road. But even then, I mean, it's not on my horizon, so at some point we'll probably just close out that fund for now. So it doesn't exist anymore. Student fee, I just budget $6,000 in that. We haven't actually used that for a couple years. That used to be where driver's ed expenses and receipts went into that fund. We haven't had anyone to teach driver's ed for a few years. Auditors have said, well, you might want to think about just closing that out. But so it doesn't have $6,000 in it. It has $2 or $9? $2. So we have to, it'll go dormant if you don't put money in and take it back out. So it's got $2 in it. But I budget $6,000 just to hold, in case we would, say next summer, want to, or summer school, if we wanted to do paid summer school, that would go in there as well. Typically when we do summer school, it's free summer school, because it's well, that's like, when we have done summer school in the past, it's been a paid summer school situation because it applies into the state aid calculation. Any questions on the budget before I get into state aid a little bit? All right, and again, I know stuff is complicated, and I'll probably be talking about, so if you have questions, stop me. If you want to come in later down the road, and if you're really intrigued in this stuff, come in and I'll gladly go over it with you. So I want to talk a little bit about state aid, because of course, state aid is pretty important for a district like ours, because about 20% of our expenses, our general fund expenses, are paid for with state aid. And so, whether if state aid goes up or down a few $100,000, can have a huge impact on what our levy, what we have to ask the local taxpayers to pay. So I kind of want to talk about because it factored in, of course, it factors into the budget, but it also factors into the tax request. So I want to talk a little bit about how state aid works, and I'll get into some of the the weeds here, some of the details, but if it, you know, and I've gone over this a few different times, so hopefully, you know, the more times I go over it, you know, you kind of get it a little better, because I certainly didn't get it, you know, first few years. It took me a few years to really wrap my head around it. And it may become more of a moot point, and I'll get to that in a little bit, because there's a good chance we will not get equalization funds for the coming years. But I'll get to that. I think it's going to be right on the edge, but if I was a betting man, I would bet probably no on equalization. But let's first start out with a basic, so the next page, the next 2 pages in your packet are just our certified state aid calculation for the 23-24 fiscal year. So first thing they do is they look at what our enrollment was on, because this is done in February. So they look at the October 1st enrollment, and it's school-age students, so age kindergarten through 12, grades kindergarten through 12, plus 4-year-old preschoolers, and if they're only part-time, then it's prorated to however many hours they were in attendance, times a 0.6 factor. And they come up with a term that's simply referred to as formula students. And it's called formula students because it's the number that's used in the tax formula. It's this, you know, it's when they come where they get football counts from, and those sort of things. But it's also tied to budget. So our formula student count on October 1st of 2022 was 254.55. They do factor in, they look at how your October first enrollment compares to your average membership over several years, and then they do make an adjustment up or down. And so our October 1st enrollment is on average just a hair higher than our average year-round attendance, and so that's why we have a multiplier of 0.9949, et cetera. But then they come back with the prior year correction, and they adjust it for total, your actual average daily membership. But nonetheless, they start with that number, that 254.55. They do that for every district in the state. And then they take your audited budget that's submitted to the state. It's submitted as an Excel spreadsheet, and so that they can pull out the numbers they want with their formula. And then they pull out certain numbers for every district in the state. And those numbers that they pull out, then, so if you look here, you've got basic funding. So the numbers they pull out for every school in the state is your poverty numbers, your LEP, your summer school allowance. That's where summer school would come into play. Your special receipts. They pull all of those numbers out for every school, and they come up with what's called as your adjusted general fund operating expenditures. And then they come up with that total number for every school in the state, and they rank you from smallest to largest school in the state. Then, for every district, they come up with, they determine your array. And your array are your district itself, the 10 districts that have an enrollment less than yours in that sequence. So the 10 closest that have a lower enrollment, and the 10 closest that have a higher enrollment. Then they drop out the outliers, the adjusted GFOE for the 2 lowest spenders and the 2 highest spenders. And they come up with the average of those remaining 17 schools, and that's how you come up with basic funding, which is that first number, the $4,081,861. And then they plug in all of your numbers that they had pulled out specific to your district. They plug in your poverty allowance, they plug in your special receipts allowance, your transportation for us, transportation allowance, your DETA, which is district education and telecommunications, And then in that, they come up with a number for your district that is your total calculated formula needs, so it's the third from the bottom up, of 4.802, or $4,802,751. And then they have a one-year adjustment. It's called formula needs stabilization. So they look at what your needs were the prior year. And if your needs are down from the prior year, they will give you the difference 1 year. And last year, our formula needs were $333,000 lower, and I've talked about this a little at previous meetings. This is because we saw a significant decline in enrollment. So our decline in enrollment compared us to a different set of schools. It pulled in more smaller enrolling schools, dropped out higher enrolling schools. So our basic funding, the top number, went down significantly. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. You'll see it on this sheet of paper, how it went down, because we're being compared to smaller schools, so it's safe to assume that the schools with smaller enrollments probably spend a little less than the schools with a little bit larger enrollment. And 15 formula kids can make a big difference in how you stack up, because you're getting compared to schools that have enrollments of 230 versus formula enrollments of 230 versus, you're getting compared Red Cloud type schools versus schools that are a little bit bigger, like maybe I'm trying to think of one. Johnson Brock is way out of our array on the high end, but Humboldt, for example, they're real close to us, which is good because they're big spenders. You'll see that. But so we get that 1 year prior year formula needs stabilization, and they come up with total needs. So that's what they say it should cost to run your district this next year. Based on our formula, it should cost about $5.1 million, $5.136 million to run your district out of the general fund, for general fund expenses. If there's one thing to take away from state aid, it's needs minus resources. So they come up with total needs, they come up with total resources, and if your needs are greater than your resources, they give you equalization aid. If it's not, they don't give you anything. It's pretty simple in that regard. It's just the nuances that gets pretty complicated. So that's what they come up with for our total needs, was the $5,136,569. Then they look at what the formula says you have for resources. So the first thing they look at is what can you generate through local property taxes. And they look at your valuation, and they take it, could you generate if you levied $1? And so the $1 is, the formula basically assumes that a district should have to levy $1 into the general fund before they get equalization aid. That doesn't have to happen. I mean, we haven't been at $1 in our general fund in several years, but typically, districts that are equalized are up around the $1 range. The metro schools are all right at $1.05. They're maxed out, and a few of them have actually done levy overrides to go above that. Then they look at your net option funding. So net option funding is if you have a positive, if you have a negative, they don't take money away from you, but they look at how many students option out of your district and how many students option into your district. If that's a positive, then they give you a number that's equal to average adjusted general fund operating expenditure for the entire state, which was like 11,000 and some change. So total adjusted general fund operating expenditures for the entire state for every district divided by total enrollment, and they come up with that option. But then this year, because of foundation aid, they subtracted out $1,500 per pupil from that. So it's actually about like $9,600 roughly, because they didn't want districts that had a positive net option. They didn't want them to get that funding twice, basically. They didn't want you to get it through foundation aid and also through option aid. So for us, they look, we're at like, this last year, I think we were at a plus 59, I think. And so they look at what your net option is, and then they give you option funding. You get that regardless of whether or not you're equalized. Then they give you 2.3% of income taxes spent in your district, or income taxes paid in your district, which for us is just shade under 25,000. Then they look at how many other actual receipts. So that's pretty much, it does not include federal reimbursement funds, so they haven't yet anyway, counted federal against you in the formula. But they look at pretty much all receipts you get other than property tax, and then anything tied to property tax, like property tax credit or cash in lieu, or homestead, so they don't count that against you, but it's like motor vehicle. Yes, it includes motor vehicles, sped reimbursement, state appropriations, pretty much car line, all the other taxes and state and local sources of revenue. They look at how much you get there in your last audit year. They give you credit for that. And then for the first year this year, they come up with the new foundation aid, which is equal to $1,500 per pupil, or per formula student. So for us, that had been 254.55 times 1,500 to come up with how much money you have, total resources. If total resources is less than total needs, they give you that in the form of equalization aid. So if you turn to the next page, is where it all comes together. Since our needs were again this year our resources were less than our needs, we got $154,000 in equalization aid. So you add that all together, what we got for net option, what we got for equalization, allocated income tax, the new foundation aid, and then they come up with the total state aid of $1,120,089. And then they do the prior year correction, which is after, and then they give you, for us it was a positive, some years it's a negative. It just has to do with whether your average daily attendance or average daily membership, your average enrollment was higher or lower than what they thought it was going to be on October 1st. For us, it was a little higher, so we got an extra $6,000 credited, almost $7,000 credited to us. So that was where we come up with the $1.2627 million that we get in state aid. Down about 70 from the prior year, but not enough to have major ripples. Any questions on that before I move into what my crystal ball tells me for coming years? Okay. If you looked at this before 5:30 today, it was not the current version. It's in here, but it didn't print right, and so I wanted to print it on a big legal. So it's the same. It's right in the packet today, but I noticed that my numbers were off of the wrong certification document. Was off the original one and not the recertified budget document. So I had to reprint it, and so it's not a big difference, but if you notice the numbers don't match entirely, that's why. So looking up here above, this goes back to 2006 and 7 across, I should say. These are all of those numbers pretty much we just went over from the previous 15 or so years. With the 23-24 showing what it was this last, what we just looked at. It's those same numbers plugged in. So I want to start with the box down on the bottom right with basic funding. So that basic funding you'll see matches. It didn't until 5:30, but it matches the $4,081,000 in this document. So that's where those numbers come from. I just put in the basic funding and the allowance that that we've got from this last year. And and so a lot of those allowances don't apply to us because we didn't have a summer school program this last year. 2 years ago, we didn't have an elementary site allowance. That's if you have 2 elementary sites that are over a certain distance apart. We didn't build a new school. We didn't have a student growth of over like 10%. And those are adjustments that certain districts get for state aid. Come up then with the same number that we just talked about at the bottom. So then what I try to do is then guess what those numbers will be next year for the 24-25 fiscal year. And that's the first thing and most important number, which is the hardest guess, is the basic funding. So what I do, the numbers above on this, if you look, so you can put these side by side then, the numbers on this sheet that has a list of schools, the top are real numbers that come up with our basic funding for state aid this year. They're in order they're in order by adjusted GFOE, from smallest to largest with the outliers pulled out. So Red Cloud and Lee were the lowest spenders in our array, and Franklin and HTRS were the highest spenders in our array. And it shows their formula, student count. So what I do then, at least to come up with this number, is I looked at what I think our enrollment's going to be on October 1st. Based on what's in PowerSchool right now, our formula enrollment would be 262.4, plus whatever they'll use for their adjustment. That'll tweak it for our average enrollment. So it'd be about 262. So up a little. So that's great. Up about 8 formula students from last year. You know, we saw a low. Hopefully we'll gradually rebound from that, which moves us up against a little bit bigger districts. I take those numbers then where we would have fallen last year, because it changes from year to year, and just guesstimating a 3% increase in operational expenditures. So I multiply whatever it was by 3%, resort them, pull out the outliers, and this HTRS is still one of the outliers, but we've got a bigger outlier because we gained another bigger school in Central Valley. And we lost Lee and we lost Red Cloud, so our smaller outliers get bigger. And we come up with an average adjusted GFOE, an average adjusted GFOE, which becomes basic funding, the guess, of about almost $4.5 million. And then I plug in guesstimates on what the other allowances will be, poverty. Actually, I just looked, it is updated, so about 194,000, so it's a little less than what's in there, but not a lot. SPED reimbursements will probably be about 340 from this last year. Transportation, I think that's right because it's based on mileage routes times certain multipliers. Mileage for routes, data, to come up with a new projected formula needs. Pull that number, plug it in up above, and so you can see that on the top, I'm talking fast now. On the top, on the right, in this right box, rectangle, you do see a history of basic funding. You can see 2 years ago our basic funding was at about 4.4. When our enrollment dropped, we saw about almost 8% decline. If this guesstimate's true, it will get us back up about 10% to where we were. Probably not quite enough to keep us equalized, but close. If that number stays lower, if that ends up being lower, then we definitely won't be equalized. If that ends up being higher, we might still remain equalized. It just really depends on how we compare to what our array is. Plug in those numbers, come up with yield from local effort, so that's current valuation that was just put into the budget for this fiscal year at a $1 levy. guesstimate on option aid, what it'll be on October 1st this year. Local income tax is a guess. Other actual receipts is a guess, but it's an educated guess based on year-to-date receipts. Foundation aid, so 262.4 times 1,500. Formula, you come up with the total formula resources. You can see that still resources are just a shade higher than needs, which means we would get, if those numbers are pretty close to accurate, we get nothing in addition to that for equalization. If basic funding is up a little bit, we could sneak into just get 30, 50,000 in additional funding. If basic funding is a little lower than that, we definitely won't get any. So it just kind of, so that does, and this is why I want to bring this up. I've been saying this for a few years now. We're going to, I think we're going to see a drop in state aid. It's inevitable. This is where I think we see that first significant drop off in that total certification before correction column. It's down about 150,000, down an additional over 200,000 from our high water mark 2 years ago. So what does that mean? I think we've been able to keep our levy pretty reasonably low as we've seen decent state aid. As state aid goes down, we have to do one of two things. We either have to cut, we can spend down a surplus, but you can only do that for so long, or you can levy more money. And those really are your three options. So nothing we have to look at this year, but I want to plant the seed for next year. Reading body language, I won't talk then about 2 years down the road. Yes, I have done projections on 2 years down the road, but I think I've already lost all of you. So I apologize for that. But that's kind of where I'm at on state aid. It's going to be down. The long and short of it is, unless basic funding really rebounds and rebounds well, or we see a huge influx of enrollment, I think we're not going to be above $1 million in state aid for the foreseeable future. By foreseeable, I mean after this year, the 2 years after this current 23-24 year. So that's kind of where I'm at. The last page is just kind of shows a history of where we're at, and I know that's more of a tax request discussion than it is a budget discussion, but I went ahead and plugged it in there. In the last 8 years that I've been involved in this chair, the board has done a really good job of not increasing compared to, say, an 18-year average or 21-year average. The last 8 years, if tomorrow's tax request is approved, we've averaged a total increase with and without QC-Puff of about less than 1% a year. So I think that's pretty good. I mean, I know our expenses have gone up by more than that. Part of that has been, board has been very forward-thinking, but also, federal funds have factored into that as well. Some of these one-time funds. But still, I don't think too many districts can say over the last 8 years they've only increased their tax request by less than 1%. On average. So something I guess to pat yourself on the back about. I know that was a lot. I apologize. Any questions?
We're approached to the public by our cash reserve. We all know why we have it, but what would you say if somebody asked you about that?
Two things. One, it depends upon which cash reserve they're referring to.
Okay.
So if you look at the budget document, another important thing to take away, necessary cash reserve is not a cash reserve. It's a terrible name for a dollar amount that you have to put in your budget. What it is, it's an arbitrary number that you have to put in your budget to make resources match need expenses. That's all it is. It's a made-up number. It doesn't reflect dollar amount. So why it's called necessary cash reserve, if I'm ever state auditor, I will be my first order of business to change the name of that fund. It needs to be in there, but one, why does it need to be published? Because it's confusing to taxpayers, and two, it's not a real number. And so call it an artificial inflator or an artificial budget balance. It could, in theory, be negative. I don't think it's ever happened, but it's not a cash reserve. Cash reserve would be the dollar amount that the amount of money we have in general fund any given month. And so it's going to be higher in January or after a big property tax payment, and it's going to be lower probably in some of the summer months, or December is usually kind of your low water mark. I was told early on when I got into this role, you want 40% of your budget in the bank on September 1st. That's about where we are. For a few different reasons. You never know what the what the future's going to bring. That way, you're not like we were in 2013, I think was the year where we didn't know if we were going to get a big enough property check in January to make payroll. And it also gives you, we've been fortunate when I've presented a budget to the board, I've generally thought that my guesstimate on expenses and receipts are going to match. Next year, I'm probably going to put forward a budget where I know we're going to spend more than we're going to take in. And I'm going to cut into that cash reserve a little bit to avoid that massive yo-yo effect in the levy going up and down. That's, you can't continue to draw in a surplus every year. Not that it's been a huge surplus, but it's been a little bit to build up that cash reserve. Part of that's been federal funds as well, one-time federal funds. But we know that the future in terms of revenue is probably not going to be as bright as it has been. And that's not even adjusted for inflation, which has been pretty significant the past couple of years. Glad you asked that, because I wanted to point that out, that necessary cash reserve is not a real number. It's a fake number that your budget spreadsheet has to come up with to make expenses match revenue. And it factors in cash on hand. And it's just not a real number, and its name is misleading and it's confusing in a budget document.
Questions for Mr. Rottinghouse? Hearing none, we'll close the budget hearing.
Thanks, guys. Building and grounds folks, I'm still waiting to hear back from Grunwald on ideas on their final proposals for boiler options. They were here actually today. They talked to Dave Pope. He was too busy. He couldn't help. He wasn't interested in at least helping them on the electrical side of things. So they had a different electrician here, and I got to hear from him. And still from Pullman's on some directional boring. And then when I've got that, I might start out sending it out in a Google Doc, kind of like I do with policy. If we want to get together, I want to have a conversation too about buses, what we want to do next on buses. So those are probably the two big things that I want to talk about. And then if we